I went to the Rocky Mountains for vacation. There are strange rules to follow. My name is Jake, and you could say I have an appreciation for the great outdoors, mostly in theory. I love the concept of nature, the crisp, fresh air, the towering trees, the break from the relentless hum of city life. But in reality, I'm a creature of convenience, accustomed to high-speed internet and the luxury of easily accessible takeout. So when my friend Tyler proposed a week-long stay at a hunting lodge deep in the Rocky Mountains, I wasn't immediately on board. Tyler, however, is a true outdoorsman. He practically lives in hiking boots and flannel. He swayed me by assuring me that the hunting lodge, though rustic, was still relatively comfortable, with minimal electricity and unreliable cell reception. What truly convinced me, though, was the cost. Tyler's uncle owned the place and was letting us stay there for next to nothing, a perk of Tyler's biannual maintenance visits to the property. He handed me a piece of paper covered in scrawled handwriting and mentioned offhandedly, just some guidelines. My uncle's a bit eccentric. I should have paid closer attention. I really should have. The so-called guidelines turned out to be a list of rules that only applied between 11:15 p.m. and 3:33 a.m. It sounded like the setup for a bad joke or a needlessly elaborate prank. But it wasn't. We reached the hunting lodge in the late afternoon, and the drive had been far more grueling than Tyler had led me to believe. The description of it as rustic was accurate, if you generously interpreted that to mean borderline falling apart. The lodge was essentially one large room with a loft for sleeping, a tiny kitchenette, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 70s. Still, there was a certain charm to it, nestled deep among the trees, with the steady murmur of Riverbend Creek providing a tranquil backdrop. The air was impossibly crisp, and the silence, once I adjusted to it, was almost profound. Tyler immediately busied himself with maintenance, checking the generator, ensuring the wood-burning stove was operational, and making sure the water pump still functioned. Meanwhile, I unpacked and attempted to get a cell signal, with little success. As dusk approached, we built a fire outside, grilled some hot dogs, and toasted marshmallows. It was picturesque, the kind of escape I'd secretly been yearning for. We chatted aimlessly, the way old friends do, our words punctuated by the occasional pop of the fire and the chirping of distant crickets. At around 10:30 p.m., Tyler let out a long yawn. "All right, man, I'm calling it a night. Early morning tomorrow, going to try to find that old hiking trail Uncle Rick mentioned." I nodded, feeling my own exhaustion creeping in. "Sounds good. I'll head in soon, too." Tyler climbed the ladder to the loft, leaving me alone by the fire. I lingered, enjoying the peaceful solitude. That's when I remembered the piece of paper he had given me. Digging it out of my backpack, I unfolded the single sheet, its title scrawled in a trembling, almost childlike script, Nighttime Protocols. Below it, the rules were listed. Rule 1, from 11:15 p.m. to 3:33 a.m., under no circumstances should you leave the lodge. Rule 2, keep the curtains drawn and every window securely shut. Rule 3, if there's knocking at the door or windows, ignore it completely. Do not respond. Rule 4, if you hear scratching, cover your ears and hum a familiar tune until it ceases. Rule 5, do not look directly into the woods after 11:15 p.m. Rule 6, if the lights flicker, avoid using any alternative light sources. Stay in darkness. Rule 7, if you hear someone calling your name, do not reply. It isn't who you think it is. Rule 8, if the temperature suddenly drops, wrap yourself in a blanket and remain still until it returns to normal. Rule 9, keep your voice to a whisper at all times. Rule 10, if you notice something inside the lodge that wasn't there before, do not acknowledge it. Act as if it doesn't exist. I read through the list again, an involuntary shiver creeping down my spine despite the lingering warmth of the dying fire. It was ridiculous, obviously, right? Tyler's uncle was likely just a superstitious old man. Yet, as the night deepened and the silence of the forest became more pronounced, I found myself increasingly unsettled. I glanced at my watch. 11:05 p.m. Deciding it was time to turn in, I carefully extinguished the fire, double-checked that the door was locked, and pulled the curtains closed, just as the instructions dictated. I even made sure the windows were latched. A part of me felt ridiculous following these bizarre rules, but another part, a primal, deeply buried instinct, felt a growing sense of foreboding. I went to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, and hummed softly to myself, just in case. Then, I climbed into the bottom bunk, leaving the loft to Tyler, who was already snoring lightly. Lying there, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind shifting through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the occasional creak of the aging lodge. My watch ticked over to 11:15 p.m. And that's when I noticed the silence had changed, denser, charged with an almost expectant energy. Then, from the depths of the woods, I saw them. Shadow walkers. I was on the verge of full-blown panic when I first heard it, a soft, almost hesitant knocking at the front door. My entire body stiffened, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. Rule number 3, do not respond. Do not acknowledge it in any way. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently willing the sound to cease. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent. I pulled the blanket around me like a protective shield, my breath catching in my throat. From the loft above, I could hear Tyler shifting in his sleep, but he didn't wake. He was a notoriously deep sleeper, something that might have been a blessing. Or a curse. The knocking was soon accompanied by a faint scraping noise, like nails slowly dragging along the wooden surface. Rule number 4, cover your ears and hum a familiar song until it stops. Clamping my hands over my ears, I began humming Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the first melody that came to mind. My voice was unsteady, barely more than a whisper, but I kept going. The knocking and scratching persisted, an endless assault on my nerves. My body trembled as I curled into myself, forcing the melody to continue. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the noises ceased. The silence that followed was just as unnerving. I slowly lowered my hands, my ears ringing. Lying frozen in the bottom bunk, I strained to hear any further disturbances. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heartbeat. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I remained tense, my body on high alert, waiting for something, anything, to break the unbearable quiet. My mind raced for a rational explanation. It had to be an animal, right? A raccoon? A stray deer brushing against the structure? But the persistent, deliberate nature of the knocking, the way it had intensified, it felt purposeful. And the scratching? That was harder to explain away. I glanced at my watch. 11:48 p.m. Still hours left until 3:33 a.m. Then, I remembered rule number 5, do not look directly at the woods after 11:15 p.m. I had already violated rule 3 in spirit by acknowledging the knocking internally. The last thing I wanted was to break any more. A rational part of my mind screamed that these were nothing but absurd superstitions, but another part, something more primal, warned me not to take chances. The hunting lodge felt colder now, the temperature dipping noticeably despite the residual warmth from the earlier fire. Rule number 8, if you feel a sudden drop in temperature, wrap yourself in a blanket and remain still until it passes. I was already swaddled in my blanket, but I pulled it tighter around me, burrowing deeper into the thin mattress. I focused on my breathing, slow, measured breaths, to steady my nerves. Then I heard it. A voice. Faint, almost whisper-like, drifting from just outside the window near my head. Jake. A cold dread spread through me. Rule number 7, if you hear a voice calling your name, do not respond. It is not who you think it is. The voice was eerily familiar, my mother's. But it was off, laced with something unnatural, something distant and hollow. Jake, let me in. The plea carried an unnatural edge, weaving itself into my consciousness, needling at my deepest fears. My mother was hundreds of miles away. There was no way it could be her. And yet, it sounded so much like her. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fists clenching the fabric of my blanket. The temptation to call out was overwhelming, but I bit my lip until I tasted blood, resisting the urge. Rule number 9, do not speak above a whisper. The voice persisted, growing more desperate, more insistent. Jake, I'm cold. I'm scared. Please. It was getting harder to ignore. The voice was so convincing, so heartbreakingly real. My mind wrestled with itself. What if it was my mother? What if something had happened, and somehow, impossibly, she had found her way here? The thought was ridiculous. Impossible. And yet, the voice chipped away at my defenses. Then, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. And then went out completely. Rule number 6, if the lights flicker, do not use any other source of light. Remain in darkness. I had a flashlight in my backpack, only a few feet away. But I didn't dare reach for it. The darkness was suffocating, absolute, broken only by a sliver of moonlight seeping through a gap in the curtains. The voice stopped the moment the lights went out. The silence that followed was heavier than before, charged with an eerie anticipation. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, every sense on edge. My ears strained for any sound, any sign of movement beyond the thin walls. The only things I could hear were the erratic pounding of my heart and the shallow, uneven rhythm of my breaths. Then I saw it. A flickering, ethereal light drifting through the trees outside the window. It was small, like the flicker of a candle, but it pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly glow. Instinctively, I knew I shouldn't be looking at it. Rule number 5 echoed in my mind, but I couldn't force myself to look away. The light seemed to call to me, drawing me in with an unnatural pull. It floated closer, gliding between the trees with an unsettling fluidity. As it neared the window, I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't a candle flame at all. It was a form. A shadowy figure cloaked in darkness, its faint, flickering light emanating from somewhere deep within. Its features were impossible to discern, yet its presence was unmistakable. An icy, unrelenting gaze bore into me. I clenched my eyes shut, finally breaking free from its hypnotic hold, and buried my face in my pillow, a quiet whimper escaping my lips. I have no idea how long I lay there, trapped in a spiral of fear, but it felt endless. When I finally dared to peek again, the glow had vanished. The hunting lodge remained shrouded in darkness, yet the suffocating silence had lifted slightly. Once again, I could make out the normal sounds of the night, the rustling wind, the steady trickle of Riverbend Creek, the familiar creaks of the aging cabin. My watch glowed faintly in the dimness. 1:17 a.m. hours remained until 3:33 a.m., and I was already drained, consumed by terror. The fear of what lay ahead gnawed at me, making it impossible to relax. Though the immediate danger seemed to have receded, the tension of waiting for the next unknown horror was almost worse. Every groan of the wooden walls, every whisper of movement outside, sent shockwaves of panic through me. I was acutely aware of my body, clammy sweat slicking my skin, the tremors in my hands, the tight knot of dread in my chest. I latched onto the rules, my only tether in a storm of fear. They were my lifeline, the only semblance of logic in this nightmare. Over and over, I recited them in my head, trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming next. Then something shifted. A scent. Faint at first, but steadily intensifying. It was sickly sweet, like rotting flowers mixed with the stench of overripe fruit. It was oddly familiar, yet unsettlingly out of place in a secluded hunting lodge. I inhaled cautiously, attempting to pinpoint the source. The smell seemed to be everywhere at once. It thickened, becoming more oppressive, saturating the air until it was all I could perceive. The putrid scent of decay coated my nostrils and clung to the back of my throat. My stomach churned. I desperately searched my memory for any mention of unfamiliar smells in the rules, but there was nothing. This was new. This was unaccounted for. The fragile illusion of security I had constructed, however weak it may have been, started to crumble. A fresh wave of panic gripped me, cold and unrelenting. The scent grew so intense that I gagged, covering my mouth and nose with the blanket in a feeble attempt to filter it out. It didn't help. The rancid smell had permeated everything. Nausea rolled through me as my head swam with dizziness. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to disappear. Then, a sound. A soft, slithering noise from the corner near the kitchenette. Slow and deliberate, like something heavy dragging itself across the wooden floor. I went rigid, straining to hear. The noise persisted, creeping closer. My pulse pounded in my ears. I needed, to turn and look, to see what was making that awful sound, but terror kept me immobilized. The suffocating darkness, the smell, the sound, it was too much. Then, it stopped. I held my breath, listening desperately. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with expectation. The only sound was the frantic hammering of my own heartbeat. And then I felt it. A light pressure against the edge of my bunk, as though something had brushed against it. I flinched, my body tensing involuntarily. My breath hitched, my muscles locking into place. I dared not move. I dared not breathe. Then, another touch, this time against my foot, through the blanket. A cold, smooth pressure. It lingered for a moment before it began to move, slow and deliberate, creeping up my leg. Every nerve in my body screamed to react, to kick, to thrash, to flee. But I was paralyzed, ensnared by my own overwhelming fear. The touch inched higher, tracing a deliberate path, up my thigh, over my stomach, creeping towards my chest. My breaths came shallow and fast, teetering on the edge of hyperventilation. My vision swam, the nauseating scent and unbearable dread pressing in from all sides. The world tilted, and I realized I was on the verge of passing out. Then, everything went still. The weight on my chest halted, pressing just enough to make breathing difficult. I held my breath, dreading what might come next. My instincts screamed that whatever was happening, it was something truly horrific. Then, a cold breath swept across my face, damp and reeking of that same putrid stench. It was close, so close that I could almost feel the presence looming over me. A whimper escaped my lips, a desperate sound I couldn't suppress, no matter how much I tried to stay silent. The pressure intensified, a suffocating force that pinned me in place. Something smooth and ice-cold brushed against my cheek, lingering briefly before it moved, slow and deliberate, toward my ear. Then, I heard it, a whisper so guttural and low it was barely more than a vibration against my skin. "We see you." This voice was different, rougher, deeper, laced with a venomous malice. Panic overwhelmed me. I couldn't take it anymore. A scream tore from my throat, raw and piercing, shattering the heavy silence in the hunting lodge. I thrashed violently, my limbs flailing in a frantic effort to rid myself of whatever had been holding me down. My screams reverberated off the wooden walls, fading into the still night beyond. I collapsed, panting, my body trembling uncontrollably. The tension released in an instant, leaving me exhausted and disoriented. I had completely disregarded rule number 9, do not speak above a whisper. I had no idea what the consequences would be, but at that moment, the relief of breaking free overshadowed all else. Cautiously, I opened my eyes. The lodge was still shrouded in darkness, though my vision had adjusted enough to make out the rough outlines of the furniture. There was nothing on me. Nothing in sight. I sat up gingerly, every muscle sore, my nerves frayed. The sickly sweet scent still lingered, though it had begun to dissipate, leaving behind only the ghost of its foul presence. My ears strained against the oppressive silence, searching for any sound beyond my erratic heartbeat. But the world was eerily quiet, too quiet. Even the usual nocturnal chorus of the woods had fallen mute. It felt as though everything was waiting. With a trembling hand, I checked my watch. 2:03 a.m. More than an hour left before 3:33 a.m. An eternity. I needed to do something. Lying there, waiting for the next nightmare to unfold, was unbearable. I needed to reclaim some control, however minor. The flashlight. My backpack. I had been too afraid to use it earlier, abiding by rule number 6. But things were changing, the rules seemed unstable, shifting, or maybe I simply didn't care anymore. I needed light. I swung my legs over the edge of the bunk, my feet touching the frigid wooden floor. Moving cautiously, I reached for my backpack, positioned near the foot of the bed. Each movement felt excruciatingly slow, each rustle of fabric magnified in the unnatural stillness. Then, a sound. A faint rustling from the loft above. Tyler. Relief surged through me so intensely that my knees nearly buckled. I wasn't alone. Tyler was here. He would help. He would tell me I was imagining things, that I was overreacting, that none of this was real. Tyler? I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. The rustling ceased. A beat of silence. Then, a slow, deliberate creak, someone shifting their weight. Tyler? I whispered again, my voice cracking slightly. Then, a voice answered. But it wasn't Tyler's. It was the same deep, rasping voice from before, the one that had whispered in my ear. Jake, it murmured from the loft, the tone eerily similar to Tyler's, but corrupted, wrong. Come up here. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was mimicking him, imitating his voice with chilling precision, trying to lure me in. We have something to show you, it continued, its tone shifting, becoming more coaxing, more insidiously persuasive. Every fiber of my being screamed that I could not go up there. Whatever lurked in the loft was not Tyler. It was something else. Something malevolent. My hands fumbled with the zipper of my backpack, my fingers clumsy and trembling. At last, I managed to yank it open and retrieve my flashlight. My grip was unsteady as I switched it on, the narrow beam of light trembling as it cut through the gloom. I aimed the flashlight toward the loft. The ladder stood empty. The loft itself remained veiled in darkness, the beam unable to pierce the murky shadows entirely. Come on, Jake. Don't be afraid, the voice cooed, now tinged with impatience. I took an instinctive step backward, distancing myself from the ladder, my pulse hammering in my ears. I needed to get out of the lodge. I needed to escape. The rules, the voice, whatever was up there, it was all too much. I turned and staggered toward the door, my grip tightening around the flashlight. My fingers trembled as they fumbled with the icy metal knob. Then, a heavy thud echoed from the loft above, as if something massive had leapt to the floor. I refused to look back. With a desperate yank, I flung the door open and bolted. I burst out into the frigid night, the flashlight's beam bouncing erratically as I sprinted. I had no clear direction, only an overwhelming need to get away. Away from the lodge, away from the voice, away from whatever had been in the loft. The trees loomed around me, their twisted forms like sinister sentinels. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs. Leaves crunched beneath my feet, but I dared not glance over my shoulder. The mere thought of seeing something chasing me sent waves of panic through my body. I ran blindly, clinging to the faintest hint of a path, praying it would lead me away from Riverbend Creek and toward the distant road. The icy air burned my lungs, but I didn't slow down. Fear was my fuel, driving me forward, an instinctive flight response. The forest felt alive, closing in around me, shadows shifting with an unnatural presence. It felt like countless unseen eyes were observing me from the depths of the darkness. Every snapping twig, every rustling leaf, every distant hoot of an owl sent a fresh surge of terror coursing through me. I didn't see the root in my path until it was too late. My foot caught, and I was thrown forward, slamming into the damp earth. The flashlight flew from my grasp, tumbling away into the underbrush. My palms scraped against the rough ground, stinging with fresh cuts. Disoriented and gasping, I scrambled forward, frantically sweeping my hands through the dirt. Cold leaves, damp soil, then, finally, my fingers curled around the flashlight. Snatching it up, I flicked it on, the shaky beam slicing through the night as I scanned my surroundings. Then I saw it. At the tree-line, just beyond the flashlight's glow, stood a figure, tall, skeletal, and cloaked in shadow. It was the same presence from before, the one with the flickering light. It remained utterly still, watching me in silence, an eerie sentinel looming in the darkness. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as I stared, frozen, the beam of my own light trapping me like prey in a predator's sight. Slowly, the figure lifted a hand, its bony fingers extending in my direction. Then, the voice returned. "You cannot escape." The whisper slithered through the trees, wrapping around me, filling the space around me like an unseen force. It was everywhere, above, behind, beneath my skin. A wave of helplessness engulfed me, an unbearable weight of despair pressing down. I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that I was going to die. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the inevitable, for the darkness to swallow me whole. But nothing happened. Time stretched endlessly. My body trembled, my mind trapped in a fog of terror. The silence became unbearable, disrupted only by my own ragged breaths. Hesitantly, I cracked one eye open. The figure was gone. Frantic, I swung the flashlight in every direction, the beam searching through the dense trees. Nothing. Just the stillness, the black void of the forest. Confusion tangled with fear. Why had it let me go? What did it want? But there was no time to dwell on those questions. I had to move. I had to keep running. Fueled by adrenaline, I forced myself to my feet and took off again, pushing my body beyond exhaustion. The burning in my lungs and the searing ache in my legs were secondary to the sheer terror gnawing at my sanity. I ran until my body could take no more, collapsing onto the forest floor, gasping for breath, shivering uncontrollably. Above me, the faint shimmer of stars peeked through the thick canopy, barely visible against the oppressive night. I forced myself to glance at my watch. 2:57 a.m. Just over 30 minutes left. If I could hold out until 3:33 a.m., maybe, just maybe, I would survive. But deep down, I knew better. The rules, the time limits, they were illusions, fragile attempts to impose order on something far beyond understanding. Whatever was hunting me wasn't bound by time. It wouldn't simply vanish when the clock struck 3:33. I wasn't just running for my life. I was running from a nightmare that had no end. I stumbled over a protruding root, crashing onto the forest floor, my flashlight flying from my grasp. Scrambling upright, I winced as my scraped palms throbbed, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. My fingers fumbled across the damp earth and cold leaves, searching blindly for the flashlight. At last, my hand found it, and I clutched it desperately, flicking the switch. A narrow beam of light pierced the darkness, my trembling hands sweeping it around frantically, searching for any sign of pursuit. Then, I saw it. A figure loomed just beyond the reach of the flashlight's glow, tall and emaciated, cloaked in darkness. Its features remained hidden, but its presence was unmistakable. It was the same being I had glimpsed before, one of the Shadow Walkers. Motionless, it simply stood there, an ominous specter, watching me with eerie patience. My breath hitched, my entire body rigid with fear. I couldn't call out. I couldn't move. The flashlight's beam had ensnared me as if I were prey frozen before a predator. Slowly, the figure lifted one hand, its elongated, skeletal fingers stretching toward me. Then came the voice again, a rasping whisper that reverberated through the trees. "You cannot escape." The words surrounded me, seeping into my skin, coiling around my mind like invisible tendrils. Despair washed over me, an all-consuming certainty that my fate was sealed. I shut my eyes tightly, bracing for the inevitable, expecting the darkness to swallow me whole. But nothing happened. Seconds stretched into an eternity as I lay trembling, every muscle coiled with dread. The silence pressed against me, broken only by the ragged sound of my breathing. Tentatively, I cracked one eye open. The figure had vanished. I swept the flashlight in frantic arcs, illuminating nothing but empty trees and thick shadows. Confusion gnawed at my terror. Why had it let me go? What was its purpose? But I had no time to contemplate. I had to keep moving. I had to get away. Summoning the last remnants of my strength, I ran again, this time even faster. My lungs burned with every breath, my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed forward, fueled by sheer panic. I kept running until my body collapsed under the weight of exhaustion, sending me sprawling onto the cold, unforgiving ground. Shuddering, I lay still, trying to catch my breath, every limb trembling uncontrollably. Above me, faint pinpricks of starlight peeked through the dense canopy, barely visible against the blackened sky. I glanced at my watch, 2:57 a.m. A little over 30 minutes left. If I could just endure until 3:33 a.m., perhaps, just perhaps, I would survive. But deep inside, I knew it was a lie. whatever hunted me wasn't bound by time. It wouldn't simply dissolve into nothingness when the appointed hour arrived. I was ensnared in something far worse than a nightmare, a reality from which there was no reprieve. The whisper lingered in the air, an unshakable omen that sent chills down my spine. The weight on my chest remained, suffocating and unrelenting. I was frozen with dread, trapped within the stifling darkness of Old Willow Stump, entirely at the mercy of the unseen horrors lurking beyond. Then, the scratching resumed. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was coming from within the stump, right next to me. My body recoiled instinctively, every fiber screaming in fear. The vibrations traveled through the wood, the sharp claws methodically scraping against the bark, inching closer. I clenched my eyes shut, hot tears trailing down my face. It was useless to resist, to struggle. There was no way out. The scratching halted, and something brushed against my hand, cold, sinuous, and impossibly smooth. A sensation like a serpent coiling around my wrist sent icy dread spiraling through me. It slithered up my arm, slow and deliberate, its touch leaving a trail of frozen fear in its wake. I wanted to scream, to wrench away, but terror held me prisoner. My body refused to move. I could only tremble and wait. The cold presence coiled around my throat, tightening ever so slightly. My breaths came in shallow, frantic gasps. Then, a sharp sting, like needles puncturing my skin. Another. And another. A sickening realization dawned on me. It was biting me. Pain bloomed, spreading like fire through my veins. My vision blurred as the agony intensified, each pulse of my heart carrying fresh waves of suffering. The darkness around me deepened, pressing in from all sides. And then, everything went black. A peculiar sensation coursed through me, a creeping numbness originating in my neck and radiating outward, consuming every fiber of my being. My vision wavered, my senses dulled to a murky haze. The voice, the guttural, insidious whisper, reached my ears, but now it felt distant, as though it were submerged beneath deep waters. Sleep, it urged, the sound curling around me like a sinister lullaby. Sleep and dream. I felt myself fading, consciousness slipping like sand through my fingers. The darkness enveloped me, a merciful abyss that promised an escape from the nightmare. Yet, somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew the horror wasn't over, it was only just beginning. I dreamt a lucid, horrifying vision. I was back inside the hunting lodge, but it was distorted, misshapen, as if reality itself had fractured. The walls twisted unnaturally, the furniture warped into grotesque shapes, and the air felt thick, suffocating. I stood frozen in the center of the room, encircled by towering, emaciated figures wrapped in shadow. Their faces remained obscured, yet I knew them, I had seen them lurking in the woods. The Shadow Walkers. Their long, skeletal fingers stretched toward me, pointing, condemning. A whispering chorus rose around me, a collective murmur filled with venomous accusation. You broke the rules, they intoned, their voices blending into one. You defied us. You resisted. I tried to respond, to plead my case, but my voice had abandoned me. I was voiceless, defenseless, ensnared by their judgment. They moved closer, shadows swallowing me whole. I felt their cold hands upon my skin, their claws biting into my flesh. I wanted to scream, but no sound came forth. Then I awoke. Dear friends, don't forget to subscribe. I'm dreaming of 1,000 subscribers. I was lying on the forest floor, outside Old Willow Stump. Dawn's first light seeped through the dense trees, casting a pale glow over the clearing. Every muscle ached, my head pounded, and my body felt drained, as though life itself had been siphoned away. Yet, against all odds, I was still breathing. I glanced at my watch, 3:35 a.m. The dreaded time had passed. Looking around, everything appeared normal. The trees, the clearing, the ancient stump, it all seemed untouched, almost serene. The whispers had vanished. The footsteps had ceased. The figures had disappeared. It was over. Or so it seemed. Deep inside, I knew the truth. I had survived, but I had been altered, scarred in ways beyond the physical. I carried the weight of that night with me, imprinted upon my soul. With unsteady legs, I pushed myself up and began walking. I had no destination in mind, only the overwhelming need to distance myself from this place. Away from the Rocky Mountains, away from the hunting lodge, away from the insidious rules that had governed that night. I trudged forward until I reached a road, and then I kept going, my feet moving out of sheer necessity. Eventually, a car approached. I lifted my arm in a weak attempt to signal, and the driver, an older woman with a kind face, stopped immediately. She took one look at me and, without hesitation, offered me a ride. I didn't tell her the truth. She wouldn't have believed me. Instead, I muttered something about getting lost while hiking and needing to reach Bozeman, Montana. I never returned to the Rocky Mountains. I never saw Tyler again. I called, texted, emailed, but he never answered. It was as if he had vanished completely, erased from existence. Of course, I worry about him, whether he's still there, trapped in that desolate lodge, following those unfathomable rules. Or worse. But there is another part of me, darker, colder, that is relieved he's gone. That I don't have to confront him, to recount the events of that night, to dredge up the fear that still clings to my bones. The nightmares remain. Night after night, I wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, suffocated by the memories. I see the figures lurking in the shadows, hear the whispers woven into the wind, feel the ghostly touch of their hands on my skin. Therapy, medication, none of it helps. The horrors of that night are etched into my very being. I've become obsessed with the Rocky Mountains, desperate for an explanation, a reason. I pore over ancient maps, delve into folklore, comb through legends whispered among locals. But the truth, whatever it is, remains elusive, just beyond my grasp. Friends, did you like the video? If you were the main character, would you follow the rules or try to escape? Write your opinion and impressions in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you in the next video.